The first thing my mother said to me that morning was not hello. It was, "You were only invited out of pity." She said it while standing beside me outside the law office of Eleanor Price, adjusting the pearl bracelet on her wrist as if she had not just opened a wound she had been pressing for years. Her black coat was perfectly tailored, her hair was smooth, and her face carried the calm confidence of a woman who believed cruelty was acceptable as long as it was spoken quietly. I stood next to her with both hands wrapped around the strap of my old brown handbag. For a moment, I said nothing. I looked at our reflection in the glass door instead. My mother looked like she belonged in a room full of lawyers, money, and family power. I looked like what I was, a 29-year-old elementary school librarian wearing a navy blazer, an ivory blouse, black flats, and the same handbag I carried to work almost every day. I had chosen the outfit carefully that morning, hoping it looked respectful enough for my grandfather's will reading. My mother's eyes moved over me once and made it clear that, in her opinion, it did not. "Don't expect anything, Nora," she added. "Your grandfather was sentimental, but that doesn't mean he saw you as important." My name sounded smaller when she said it. I had spent most of my life hearing that tone, the one that made every choice I made seem like proof that I had failed to become someone worth admiring. My brother Grant worked in the family company. My sister Madison had built a polished public life out of charity events, designer clothes, and the Whitaker name. I had chosen books, children, quiet mornings, and a small apartment I paid for myself. In my mother's world, that was not independence. It was embarrassment. Through the glass door, I could see the rest of my family already gathered inside. Grant stood near the fireplace in a charcoal suit. Checking his watch like the reading of our grandfather's will was another business meeting that needed to stay on schedule. Madison was by the window, dressed in cream silk, speaking to two cousins with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned whether she belonged in any room. Everyone looked polished, expensive, and ready to receive what they believed they deserved. No one looked like they had come to mourn. I thought about turning around. I could have walked back to my car, driven to my apartment, made tea, and spent the morning with the handwritten birthday cards Grandpa Theodore had given me over the years. That would have hurt less than standing beside my mother while she reminded me that I was considered an obligation. But then I remembered something Grandpa used to tell me whenever my family made me feel small. "Nora," he would say, "people reveal themselves most clearly when they think nothing important is watching." I did not know why that sentence came back to me then, but it steadied me enough to stay. My mother reached for the door handle, then paused as if remembering one final instruction. "Whatever happens in there, be gracious," she said. "This is about your grandfather's legacy, not your feelings." I looked at her and almost answered, but there was no point. She had never understood that Grandpa's legacy was not only the company, the properties, or the money everyone whispered about. To me, his legacy was the Saturday mornings he spent with me at the old Whitaker Memorial Library, the way he remembered the names of retired workers, and the quiet kindness he showed people who could never do anything for him in return. When we entered the office, the conversation inside softened but did not stop. That was how my family usually reacted to me. They noticed me just enough to make it clear that I had not changed the room. Madison's eyes landed on me first, and her smile sharpened. "Nora, you made it," she said, as if my presence required explanation. Grant gave me a brief nod, polite but empty, before turning back to my mother with a warmer expression. A few relatives glanced at my handbag, my shoes, my simple blazer, and then looked away. No one said they were sorry about Grandpa. No one asked how I was holding up. The law office was warm, elegant, and silent in all the wrong ways. Dark wooden shelves lined the walls, leather chairs surrounded a long conference table, and rain tapped lightly against the tall windows. Eleanor Price entered from a side door carrying a thick folder with both hands. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck and eyes that gave away very little. I had met her only a few times when Grandpa was alive, but I knew he trusted her. That alone made me trust her more than anyone else in the room. "Thank you all for coming," Eleanor said. Mr. Theodore Whitaker prepared his estate instructions carefully, and today's reading will follow his final will and accompanying directives. As everyone sat down, my mother took the chair closest to the head of the table. Grant sat beside her, and Madison took the seat on the other side. The rest of the relatives filled the room naturally, as if their places had always been reserved. I found the last empty chair near a bookshelf at the back. It was not dramatic, and no one told me to sit there, but the message was clear enough. I had been included, but not welcomed. Eleanor began reading the will in a steady voice. To my mother, Grandpa left lifetime use of the Whitaker estate, including the gardens, lakefront grounds, and the east wing of the house, as long as the property was maintained according to his preservation terms. My mother's face remained composed, but I saw satisfaction in the slight lift of her chin. To Grant, he left a large block of non-voting company shares, several investment accounts, and the right to continue in his executive position pending board approval. Grant nodded, as though he had received confirmation of something he already believed belonged to him. To Madison, Grandpa left the Vermont Lake House, my grandmother's jewelry collection, and a trust income connected to public charitable work under the Whitaker name. Madison lowered her eyes just enough to look emotional, though her hand had already moved to her phone beneath the table. Other relatives received money, antiques, vehicles, land parcels, and personal gifts. With each name called, the room filled with small movements of satisfaction, a relieved breath, a hidden smile, a whispered comment. The grief that had been expected in that room thinned into calculation. I told myself I did not expect anything. My life was small, but it was mine. I had never asked Grandpa for money, and I did not want to sit there measuring his love in houses or accounts. Still, some part of me hoped for a letter. Grandpa had always written to me. Every birthday card, every note tucked into a book, every little message he left on my desk when I visited him had made me feel seen in a family that preferred not to look at me. If there was one final sentence in his handwriting, I thought it would be enough. Then Eleanor turned a page and slowed slightly. "And to my granddaughter, Nora Elaine Whitaker," she read. The room shifted. Grant stopped checking his watch. Madison looked up. My mother did not turn around, but her shoulders became still. Eleanor reached into the folder and removed a small sealed envelope, an old brass key, and a plain white card. She placed them on the table before continuing. "I leave the enclosed personal message, the brass key marked with my private seal, and the numbered card attached to this directive. She will understand their purpose when the time comes." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Madison let out a soft laugh and covered it with 2 fingers. "That's sweet," she said. Grandpa left Nora a little mystery. A cousin near the window muttered that he had expected something more interesting. Grant leaned back, the tension leaving his face. My mother finally turned to look at me, and the expression in her eyes hurt more than her words outside the door. It was not surprise, it was confirmation. She looked at the key, the card, and then at me, as if the universe had just proven her right. "At least it suits you," she said. "Something small, something quiet." A few people smiled. I felt heat rise in my face, but I did not answer. Eleanor Price gathered the items and walked them to me herself. When she placed the envelope, the key, and the card into my hands, her fingers pressed lightly against mine for half a second, as if she wanted me to pay attention. The key was heavier than it looked, old brass darkened at the edges. At the top of it was a tiny lantern shape. My breath caught because Grandpa used to draw small lanterns in the corners of my birthday cards. I turned the white card over and read the numbers printed across it. 390, 8.2 W45, 1,970, 9R. Around me, the room had already moved on. My family saw a useless key and a strange card. But I was a librarian, and to me, that line did not look random at all. It looked like a code. For the first time that morning, I wondered if Grandpa had not left me the smallest inheritance. I wondered if he had left me the only one that mattered. For the rest of the will reading, I barely heard anything clearly. Eleanor Price continued speaking, My relatives continued shifting in their expensive chairs, and the room slowly returned to its quiet rhythm of legal language and hidden satisfaction. But my attention stayed on the three things in my lap: the sealed envelope, the old brass key, and the white card printed with the strange line of numbers. 398.2, W45 1000, 979R. I kept reading it without moving my lips, afraid that if anyone noticed my interest, they would find a way to take even this from me. To my family, the card meant nothing. It was another one of Grandpa Theodore's odd little gestures, the kind they had always dismissed as sentimental. But to me, the numbers had a shape. They reminded me of library labels, old catalog cards, shelf codes, and the quiet order hidden inside rooms full of books. I had spent enough years around those systems to know when something was random and when something was meant to be found. Grandpa had known that too. That was the part that made my hands tremble. My mother had always treated my work like a soft failure. When I became an elementary school librarian, she did not congratulate me. She stared at the letter of employment, as if it were a medical diagnosis. "You went to college to shelve picture books?" she asked. I told her that I helped children learn to read, organized literacy programs, and built learning spaces for students who did not have books at home. She listened with the thin patience of someone waiting for a child to finish making an excuse. Then she said, "Your brother is helping run a company. Your sister has turned our family name into a brand, and you chose a job any quiet woman with a cardigan could do." That was how she saw me. Quiet, replaceable, small. It did not matter that I loved my work. It did not matter that the children ran toward me in the hallway, waving books in the air because they had found a story they could finally read by themselves. It did not matter that some parents cried when they told me their sons or daughters had started reading at home for the first time. In my mother's world, value had to be visible from across a room. It had to shine, impress, command, and preferably increase in market value by the end of the quarter. Grant understood that world perfectly. Even as a boy, he knew how to speak in numbers that made adults nod. He joined Grandpa at company lunches, sat beside executives, and learned how to shake hands before he learned how to apologize. Madison chose a different path, but one my mother respected just as much. She learned how to be admired. She smiled at cameras, hosted charity events, wore the right designers, and made people feel that standing near her was a kind of privilege. My mother called Madison graceful. She called Grant driven. She called me sensitive, which in our house was never a compliment. For years, I tried to become less disappointing. In high school, I joined the debate club because Grant said I needed to learn how to speak with confidence. I quit after 3 months because I hated turning every conversation into a contest. In college, I took 2 business classes because my mother said it would be useful, but the lectures felt like a language I could translate without ever wanting to speak. I did well enough, but I never felt awake there. I felt awake in the campus library, sitting on the floor between shelves, helping other students find sources for papers they had waited too long to start. I felt awake during volunteer reading hours, when children who hated books slowly realized stories were not punishments, they were doors. Grandpa noticed before anyone else did. During my second year of college, I came home for Thanksgiving and found him alone in his study, while the rest of the family argued downstairs about seating arrangements for dinner. He was repairing the spine of an old book with a carefulness that made the room feel sacred. I asked if he needed help, and he handed me a small brush without looking surprised. We worked in silence for almost 20 minutes before he said, "Your hands are calmer when you're doing something you actually care about." I remember freezing with the brush between my fingers. No one in my family talked that way. They asked what I planned to do, how much I planned to earn, whether my choices made sense. Grandpa was the only one who seemed interested in whether my life felt true from the inside. I told him I was thinking about library science, but that Mom would hate it. He kept smoothing the paper along the old book's spine and said, "Your mother has spent her life mistaking volume for value. Don't inherit that from her." That sentence stayed with me long after Thanksgiving ended. It did not make me brave all at once. Nothing did. I still flinched when my mother frowned. I still felt the old hunger for her approval whenever Madison posted another perfect photo from some event where I had not been invited. But Grandpa's words gave me a private place to stand. They reminded me that my life did not have to be loud to matter. After I became a librarian, Grandpa started visiting my school twice a year. He never announced himself as Theodore Whitaker, founder of Whitaker Timber and Tools. He came as Mr. Theo, an old man with a warm coat, a wooden cane, and pockets full of butterscotch candies he was not supposed to give out, but somehow always did. He donated books, but he never let the school put his name on a plaque. He helped repair a broken reading bench one winter afternoon because the district maintenance request had been ignored for 3 months. He sat on tiny chairs during story hour and listened like the children were teaching him something important. My mother hated those visits when she found out. "He has real responsibilities," she told me once over the phone. "You shouldn't encourage him to waste his energy playing library grandfather." I almost told her that he seemed happier in my little school library than he ever did at her charity dinners, but I swallowed the words. Back then, I still believed peace could be earned by staying quiet. What my mother never knew was that Grandpa and I had our own traditions. Every December, we organized a small book drive for families who could not afford holiday gifts. Every spring, we visited the old Whitaker Memorial Library, a building the family had technically owned for decades but mostly forgotten. It sat near the older part of town, where the original mill workers had once lived. The paint was peeling, the roof leaked in 2 corners, and half the shelves smelled of dust and old glue. To my family, it was a useless property waiting for redevelopment. To Grandpa, it was the place where he had learned to read after his father pulled him out of school to work. We spent hours there. I sorted boxes of donated books, repaired torn covers, and made handwritten labels for shelves no one had touched in years. Grandpa checked old cabinets, read through yellowed files, and sometimes stood in the center of the reading room with a look I could not understand. When I asked what he was thinking, he would smile and say, "Just making sure the right things are still where they belong." At the time, I thought he meant books. Now, sitting in Eleanor Price's office with that brass key in my lap, I was no longer sure. A soft burst of laughter pulled me back into the room. Madison was whispering to one of our cousins, her eyes flicking toward the key in my hands. Grant had moved on completely, speaking under his breath to my mother about board approvals and estate conditions. My mother listened with the focused expression she reserved for matters she considered important. None of them looked sad. None of them looked curious about Grandpa's final message to me. They had already decided it was meaningless, because they had already decided I was. I looked down at the key again. The tiny lantern at the top caught the light. Grandpa had drawn lanterns on my birthday cards for as long as I could remember. Sometimes they appeared beside my name. Sometimes in the corner of the envelope. Sometimes next to a sentence that seemed ordinary when I first read it, but felt deeper years later. One card from my 21st birthday came back to me suddenly. He had written, "When everyone rushes toward the obvious door, look for the one with the quiet handle." At the time, I thought it was just Grandpa being poetic. Now I wondered if he had been teaching me how to follow a trail I did not know existed. Eleanor finished the final section of the will and closed the folder. People began standing almost immediately. Chairs moved back. Relatives leaned toward each other, already comparing what they had received. Someone mentioned appraisals. Someone else asked about transfer timelines. Madison hugged my mother with one arm, while checking her phone with the other. Grant shook Eleanor's hand and asked whether the company documents could be reviewed by his own legal team. I remained seated for a moment longer. The sealed envelope rested against my palm. I wanted to open it there, but instinct stopped me. The room did not deserve Grandpa's last words to me. Not while my mother stood a few feet away, looking satisfied that my inheritance had embarrassed me. Not while Madison was pretending not to laugh. Not while Grant had already returned to treating me like background furniture. When I finally stood, my mother turned toward me. "I hope you understand now," she said quietly. "Your grandfather cared for you, Nora, but caring is not the same as trusting someone with responsibility." I held the envelope, the key, and the card tighter in my hand. For the first time all morning, I did not feel the need to answer her. Maybe because her words hurt too much, or maybe because something in that strange numbered card had begun to feel stronger than the shame she wanted me to carry. As I left the office, rain blurred the windows and softened the world outside. Behind me, my family stayed close to the table where the money had been named. Ahead of me, the brass key pressed into my palm like a question. I did not know what had opened yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Grandpa Theodore had never wasted a symbol, a word, or a promise. If he had left me a lantern, then somewhere, he had also left me a darkness I was meant to walk through. By the time I reached my apartment, the rain had grown heavier. I parked beneath the old maple tree outside my building and sat in the car for a while, listening to the windshield wipers drag water from side to side. My family had left the law office with houses, company shares, jewelry, accounts, and the satisfaction of being named in ways that sounded important. I had left with a sealed envelope, a brass key, and a white card printed with a strange code no one else had cared to understand. Inside my apartment, everything felt too quiet. My kitchen table still held the mug I had used that morning before the will reading. A stack of returned library books sat near the door, waiting to be taken back to school. Normally, those ordinary things comforted me. That afternoon, they made my life feel painfully small compared to the world my family admired. I took off my coat, placed my handbag on the chair, and set Grandpa's final gifts on the table. The brass key looked older under the warm kitchen light. Its edges were worn smooth, and at the top was the tiny shape of a lantern. I touched it with my thumb, and the memory came back immediately. Grandpa had drawn small lanterns in the corners of my birthday cards for as long as I could remember. Sometimes they were beside my name. Sometimes they appeared near a sentence that sounded simple at first but stayed with me for years. I used to think it was only his private symbol for me. Now, looking at the key, I was no longer sure it had ever been just sentimental. The envelope was thick cream paper, sealed with dark wax. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's handwriting. Nora Elaine Whitaker. I held it for a moment before opening it, because I knew that once I read the letter, there would be no more new words from him waiting somewhere in the world. Then I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the page inside. My dear Nora, if you are reading this, then the room has already shown you what I needed you to see. Do not let their laughter make you doubt the gift. The key will open only what patience can find, and the card will matter only to someone who still remembers where stories are kept. Start with the number. Trust the work you chose, even if they never understood it. With all my love, Grandpa. I read the letter twice, then a third time. The first sentence hurt because I understood it too well. Grandpa had known they would laugh. He had known my mother would reduce his final gift to something small and harmless. He had known I would sit in that room, holding myself together while everyone else measured worth in houses, money, and shares. But instead of protecting me from that moment, he had left me something inside it. He had wanted me to see the room clearly. I picked up the white card again. The strange line printed across it no longer felt random. At the law office, I had noticed the pattern, but had been too shaken to think clearly. Now, with Grandpa's letter open beside me, the meaning began to form. The first number belonged to folklore and old stories. The letters and year looked like an old catalog marker, the kind I had seen in archived library records. My family had laughed because they saw nonsense. I saw a shelf. I opened my laptop and searched the Whitaker Memorial Library catalog. The modern system gave me nothing, which did not surprise me. The old building had never been fully digitized, and most of its early records existed only in scanned ledgers the town archive had uploaded years ago. They were handwritten, faded, and difficult to read, but I knew how to move through them. I had spent too many afternoons fixing the gaps left by people who thought old records were useless until they needed something from them. After nearly 20 minutes, I found a matching entry under children's folklore and local tales. The title stopped me cold. The Lantern Room. The donor was listed as T. Whitaker. The location was marked as the rear archive cabinet. The status was restricted. I leaned back from the screen, suddenly aware of the key sitting beside my hand. Grandpa had not left me a random object. He had left me directions. The card pointed to a forgotten record, the record pointed to the old library, and the key was almost certainly meant to open whatever had been hidden there. The name of the book unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Lanterns had always been our quiet symbol, something I thought belonged only to birthday cards and private memories. Seeing that word inside an old archive record made the room feel smaller around me. It was as if a door I had walked past my entire life had finally made a sound. A memory surfaced with surprising clarity. I was 12, carrying a box of donated books through the rear hallway of Whitaker Memorial, while Grandpa stood before a locked door with a ring of keys in his hand. I had asked what was inside. He smiled and said, "Things waiting for the right reader." At the time, I thought he meant rare books. Now I wondered if he had meant something else entirely. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Madison. "Hope your little mystery inheritance is exciting. Maybe it opens a dollhouse." A second message followed almost immediately. "Don't take Mom's comment personally. You know how she is." I stared at the screen until it went dark. That was how my family worked. Someone hurt me, then someone else explained why I should not be hurt. I turned the phone face down and looked again at Grandpa's letter. "Do not let their laughter make you doubt the gift." For years, I had let their laughter decide how much space I was allowed to take. I had apologized for my quiet life, defended my work, and treated my own choices like something that needed permission. But Grandpa had tied his final clue to the one part of me they dismissed most. Before leaving, I made copies of everything. I scanned the letter and the card, emailed them to myself, and saved them in a folder called Lantern. Maybe it was caution. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the part of me that had grown up around people who knew how to make inconvenient things disappear. Once the copies were safe, I slipped the originals into my handbag and put the brass key in my coat pocket. The library closed at 6, but I still had volunteer access because of the literacy program I ran there twice a month. I checked the time. If I left immediately, I could reach Whitaker Memorial before the evening staff locked the building. Outside, the rain had softened the streetlights into pale circles. As I drove across town, my mother's words tried to follow me. "You were only invited out of pity." But this time, they did not feel as final as they had that morning. By the time I reached Whitaker Memorial, the sky had darkened, and the old brick building stood at the corner of Briar Street, like something the world had forgotten, but not yet defeated. One lamp flickered beside the entrance. The front steps were cracked. Rain ran down the windows in thin silver lines. I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the place where Grandpa had taught me that forgotten things were not always worthless. Then I closed my hand around the brass key, stepped out into the rain, and walked toward the door. The front door of Whitaker Memorial Library resisted me at first, swollen slightly from years of rain and neglect. I had to press my shoulder against the old wood before it gave way with a tired groan. The sound echoed through the lobby, and for a moment I stood still, listening to the building settle around me, as if it had been waiting for someone to return. The air smelled of dust, old paper, and damp stone. Only one row of lights had been left on near the circulation desk, casting a pale glow across the worn floorboards. The library had closed to the public half an hour earlier, but the volunteer access card still worked. I had used it many times for children's reading programs, book drives, and weekend restoration projects. Never once had I imagined I would come here carrying a key from my grandfather's will. Rain moved softly against the windows. Beyond the glass, Briar Street was nearly empty. The whole town seemed to have pulled itself indoors, leaving the old library alone with its shadows. I walked past the children's section, where small chairs sat upside down on tables, and past the local history shelves where Grandpa used to stop for longer than necessary. I could almost see him there in his brown coat, running one finger along the spines of books no one else opened, smiling whenever I asked why he cared so much about forgotten things. "Forgotten does not mean worthless," he had told me once. "It only means no one patient enough has come back yet." That memory stayed with me as I moved toward the rear hallway. The public part of the library ended at a narrow corridor lined with framed photographs of the town before it became polished enough for outsiders. In one picture, Whitaker Timber and Tools was still a small mill with sawdust piled near the loading doors. In another, workers stood in front of the first company truck, sleeves rolled up, faces tired but proud. Grandpa was young in one of the photos, barely older than Grant was now, standing beside men whose names my family no longer mentioned at dinners. At the end of the hallway was the locked archive door. I had seen it many times. As a child, I had imagined rare books behind it, maybe old maps, maybe letters from important people. As an adult, I had stopped wondering. There were always too many immediate tasks: catalog errors, broken shelves, leaking pipes, children waiting for story hour. The door had become part of the background. One more old thing inside an old building. Now the brass key in my hand made it impossible to ignore. The lock was tarnished, but the lantern-shaped key slid in smoothly. For one tense second, nothing happened. Then, I turned it. The click was soft, almost ordinary, but it moved through me like a verdict. A door that had been closed for most of my life opened under my hand. The archive room was colder than the hallway. I found the wall switch and turned it on. 2 overhead bulbs flickered, then steadied, revealing a narrow room packed with wooden cabinets, metal file drawers, rolled maps, and shelves of boxed records. Dust covered almost everything except one cabinet at the far end. That cabinet looked as if someone had cared for it long after the rest of the room had been abandoned. I stepped closer. It was made of dark wood, taller than my shoulders, with a small lantern carved into the center panel. My chest tightened. The same symbol from the key. The same symbol from Grandpa's cards. The same symbol that had followed me quietly for years while I mistook it for affection instead of instruction. There was another lock below the carving. The brass key fit there too. Inside the cabinet were no jewels, no cash, no dramatic stack of bearer bonds like something from an old movie. Instead, there were labeled folders, sealed envelopes, a leather notebook, several rolled property maps, and a flat archival box tied with cotton tape. Everything had been arranged with the careful precision I knew from Grandpa's study. This was not a hiding place built in panic. This was a system. On top of the first folder rested a letter addressed to me. I recognized Grandpa's handwriting before I touched it. My hands were unsteady as I opened the envelope. My dear Nora, if you are standing in this room, then you found the path I hoped you would find. I am sorry I could not explain it plainly. Some truths must be protected until the right person is ready, and some people must be allowed to reveal themselves before the truth arrives. This room contains records of what I spent my life building after I understood that money alone does not make a family honorable. Do not try to understand everything tonight. Take the files marked First Review to Eleanor Price. Trust her. Trust your own eyes. And remember this: the loudest heirs are not always the rightful guardians. With love and faith in you, Grandpa. I lowered the letter slowly. Until that moment, part of me had still been waiting for the discovery to become small. A book, maybe. A private message. A sentimental explanation that would let my family's laughter remain cruel but correct. But the words in Grandpa's letter did not feel sentimental. They felt prepared. I looked back into the cabinet and found a folder marked First Review. Beneath it were others labeled Property Holdings, Voting Rights, Community Programs, Patents, and Trust Directives. I did not know what half of it meant, but I understood enough to feel the floor shift beneath my life. I opened the first folder. The top page carried the title, The Whitaker Lantern Trust. Below it was a legal summary, dense with language that made my head ache after the first few lines. I forced myself to slow down. The trust had been created years earlier by Theodore Whitaker. It held assets separate from the ordinary estate. It was connected to the preservation of Whitaker Hollow, the old library, several community properties, certain company voting rights, and a list of charitable obligations that had to be maintained annually. Then I saw my own name. Not once, several times. Nora Elaine Whitaker appeared on forms I barely remembered signing. donation acknowledgments, literacy program reports, library restoration receipts, community supply records, and annual confirmations of educational use. My first reaction was fear. Had I signed something I did not understand? Had Grandpa used my name without telling me? But as I read more carefully, the memory of each document returned. I had signed after book drives. I had confirmed delivery of donated supplies. I had helped record volunteer hours. I had filed reports because Grandpa said the library needed clean records, if anyone ever questioned its purpose. At the time, those tasks had seemed small. Necessary, maybe, but ordinary. In the folder, they looked like evidence. Every signature had helped prove that the library and the surrounding properties were still serving the community. Every record had strengthened the purpose of the trust. I had not been managing a fortune. I had been doing what I always did, keeping track of things other people were too busy to notice. I sank into the wooden chair beside the cabinet. The room was silent, except for the rain and the old heating pipes ticking behind the wall. I wanted Grandpa there so badly that the wanting hurt, physically. I wanted to ask him why he had not told me. I wanted to ask whether he had known how frightened I would feel. Most of all, I wanted to hear him say that I had not misunderstood everything. But there was only the cabinet, the files, and the next folder waiting beneath my hand. I opened the property map. Whitaker Hollow spread across the page in careful lines. The library, the old mill, the workers' cottages, the playground, the community hall, and several undeveloped acres near the creek. I knew the area well. To most of my family, it was aging land in a part of town that had not become profitable fast enough. To Grandpa, it had been the beginning of everything. A paper clipped to the map carried a more recent date. My eyes caught my mother's name first, then Grant's. The heading read, Caldwell Development Preliminary Sale Contacts. My stomach tightened. I read quickly, then forced myself to read again more slowly. The document summarized attempts to discuss the sale of Whitaker Hollow to a private developer. It mentioned luxury townhomes, commercial rezoning, demolition assessments, and projected returns large enough to explain the hungry confidence I had seen in Grant's face at the law office. Near the bottom of the page, Grandpa had written a note in red ink. Unauthorized sale attempt. Below that, in a harder line, he had added 6 words. She will sell it if unchecked. I did not need him to write my mother's name again. I already knew. For a long time, I sat without moving. The room around me seemed to change. It was no longer only an archive. It was a warning. Grandpa had not left me a key because he wanted me to solve a sweet little puzzle. He had left it because something he loved was in danger, and he believed I might be the only person in the family willing to protect it without asking what I would gain. My phone buzzed again, but I did not look at it. I already knew it would be someone from the family. Someone laughing, explaining, dismissing, or pretending. None of them knew I was here. None of them knew that the thing they had called small was opening into something bigger than all the gifts read aloud in that office. I gathered the first review folder, Grandpa's letter, the property map, and the page marked with my mother's unauthorized sale attempt. I did not take everything. Grandpa had told me not to understand it all tonight, and for once, I was grateful for an instruction that limited the terror. I photographed the cabinet, the labels, and the documents I removed. Then I locked the rest back inside. When I stepped out of the archive room, the hallway looked different. The same faded photographs hung on the wall. The same floorboards creaked beneath my shoes, but I no longer felt like a visitor in a forgotten building. I felt like someone had placed a fragile burning lantern in my hands. At the front desk, I paused and looked back toward the darkened library. My family had spent the afternoon celebrating what they thought Grandpa had given them. My mother had smiled because she believed I had received nothing of consequence. But in the old room behind the library, I had found her name in a file she was never meant to see. And by morning, Eleanor Price would see it too. I did not sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa's red ink beneath my mother's name. She will sell it if unchecked. The sentence was not dramatic, not emotional, and somehow that made it worse. Grandpa had not written it in anger. He had written it like a man recording weather before a storm. By 7 the next morning, I was standing outside Eleanor Price's office with the first review folder pressed against my chest. The rain had stopped, but the city still looked washed out and uncertain. I had called ahead, expecting to leave a message with her assistant. Instead, Eleanor herself answered and told me to come immediately. When I entered her office, she did not look surprised to see the folder. She only closed the door, gestured for me to sit, and placed a yellow legal pad on the table between us. "You found the archive room," she said. The calmness of her voice made my throat tighten. "You knew it existed?" "I knew your grandfather had prepared something there. I did not know whether you would find it before the 5th day." I sat down slowly. "Why the 5th day?" Eleanor folded her hands. "Because Theodore wanted the first reading to be completed without interference. He wanted the visible estate distributed first. Only after that could the trust verification be triggered." "Triggered by what?" "By you bringing me the first review documents." I looked down at the folder. Until that moment, some part of me had still hoped I was misunderstanding the scale of what I had found. But Eleanor's expression told me I had not walked into a memory. I had walked into a plan. She opened the folder and began reviewing the documents page by page. At first, she read silently. Then she took off her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and looked at me with a seriousness that made my hands go cold. "Nora," she said, "what your grandfather placed in that archive is not a sentimental inheritance. It is the control structure for a trust he spent decades building." "I saw my name," I said. "On forms, on reports. I don't understand why." "You were helping maintain the trust's purpose without knowing it. The library programs, the book drives, the restoration logs, the community supply records, those were not only acts of service. They were proof that the properties held by the trust continued to serve the public purpose Theodore created them for." I stared at her. "So I signed legal documents without knowing?" "You signed acknowledgments and program records. Nothing improper. Nothing that transferred liability to you. Your grandfather was careful about that, but your involvement showed continuity. It showed care. It showed that you understood the value of the places he protected, even if you did not know their financial worth." The words were too large to take in all at once. I thought of all the afternoons I had spent, sorting donations, labeling shelves, carrying boxes, writing reports for programs no one in my family cared about. I had thought I was helping Grandpa keep an old library alive. Apparently, I had also been helping him keep a fortune out of careless hands. Eleanor continued. "The Whitaker Lantern Trust holds assets separate from the estate read earlier this week. The will distributed certain personal and family assets. The trust is different. It contains voting rights, land protections, investment accounts, intellectual property, and charitable directives." "How much?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. She hesitated, not because she did not know, but because she seemed to understand that the number would change the air in the room. "Tens of millions," she said. "Possibly more, depending on current valuations." I looked away from her. The window behind her desk faced a narrow street lined with wet trees. A delivery truck moved past slowly. A man in a gray coat hurried across the sidewalk with coffee in one hand. Everything outside continued, as if the floor beneath my life had not just vanished. "There has to be a mistake," I whispered. "There is no mistake." "I'm a librarian." "Yes," Eleanor said gently. "Your grandfather considered that one of your qualifications." I almost laughed, but it came out like a breath breaking in half. My mother said I couldn't even manage my own life. Your mother has been wrong about many things. For the first time since Grandpa died, someone said it plainly enough that I could not soften it for anyone else. Eleanor turned to another page and tapped the section marked Trust Succession. "Theodore's instructions are clear. If you identified the archive clue and delivered the documents within 5 days of the will reading, you would be named primary guardian and directing trustee of the Whitaker Lantern Trust, subject to formal verification. Guardian, I repeated. He did not use the word owner. That was deliberate. He did not want this treated as a prize. He wanted it treated as a responsibility. That sounded like Grandpa. It also terrified me. What happens now? Now I verify the documents with the legal team. Tomorrow is the 5th day. Your family will be called back to this office. The trust will be disclosed. The thought of facing them again made my stomach tighten. I could already hear Madison laughing before she understood, Grant interrupting before Eleanor finished, my mother looking at me as if I had stolen something that naturally belonged to someone better dressed. I don't know if I can do this, I said. Eleanor's face softened. You do not have to know everything today. You only have to decide whether you are willing to protect what your grandfather asked you to protect. I thought of the library, the old mill, the workers' cottages, the playground, and Grandpa's red ink. Then I thought of my mother's smile when she believed I had inherited nothing. I'm willing, I said, though my voice shook. The next 24 hours moved like a long hallway with no windows. Eleanor's office called twice for permission to confirm records connected to my volunteer work. Mrs. Bell called after Eleanor contacted her, and the moment she heard my voice, she became quiet in a way that told me she knew more than she had ever said. Theodore hoped you would find it, Mrs. Bell told me. He said if anyone remembered the library properly, it would be you. I held the phone tighter. Why didn't he tell me? Because he wanted to know who you were when you thought there was nothing to gain. By the time I hung up, I was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that I had to sit on the kitchen floor with one hand over my mouth until the wave passed. I was not crying because of the money. I was crying because Grandpa had seen years of small things I had done without knowing they mattered. The next afternoon, I returned to Eleanor's office for the second family meeting. This time, no one stood outside with me. My mother had arrived early with Grant and Madison. When I entered the conference room, conversation stopped completely. Vivian looked irritated, not frightened yet. Grant had a leather folder open in front of him and a pen in his hand, as if he planned to correct whatever inconvenience had brought us back. Madison leaned toward a cousin and whispered something that made them both smile. My mother's eyes narrowed when she saw me. What is this about? She asked Eleanor before I had even sat down. We already completed the reading. Eleanor remained standing at the head of the table. 2 other attorneys sat beside her, each with certified copies of documents arranged neatly in front of them. The reading of the will was completed, Eleanor said. Today concerns a separate legal instrument created by Theodore Whitaker outside the ordinary estate. Grant's expression sharpened. What separate instrument? The Whitaker Lantern Trust. The room went quiet in a different way. Not silent yet, just alert. Madison tilted her head. That sounds like one of Grandpa's charity projects. In part, Eleanor said. But it is considerably more than that. My mother glanced at me, then back to Eleanor. Why is Nora here for this? Because Nora is central to the Trust's succession directive. A small laugh escaped Madison before she could stop it. Grant looked annoyed. My mother did not laugh. She stared at Eleanor as if the lawyer had just used the wrong name. Eleanor opened the first folder. The assets distributed earlier this week included residential property, personal collections, portions of investment accounts, and non-voting company shares. Those distributions remain valid. However, they represent only the visible portion of Theodore Whitaker's holdings. Grant sat forward. Define visible. Eleanor looked directly at him. The Whitaker Lantern Trust holds 1% of the voting control connected to Whitaker Timber and Tools, subject to preservation conditions. It also holds Whitaker Hollow, including the Memorial Library, the original mill property, the workers' cottages, the playground, the community hall, associated land parcels, several investment accounts, certain patents and licensing rights, and the educational endowment, attached to the trust. No one moved. For the first time since I had known him, Grant seemed unable to form a sentence. Madison's lips parted slightly. The cousin beside her stopped smiling. My mother's face had gone still in a way that made her look less polished and more like stone. Eleanor continued, her voice even. Theodore Whitaker left binding instructions regarding who would direct, protect, and, when appropriate, distribute resources from that trust after his passing. Grant recovered first. As acting development director, that should come to me. No, Eleanor said. My mother's hand tightened around the edge of the table. Eleanor turned one page. The directing authority belongs to Nora Elaine Whitaker. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the rainwater dripping from the awning outside the window. Madison stared at me as if I had become visible in a language she could not read. Grant looked from Eleanor to me, then back again, his face losing color. My mother did not look at me at first. She looked at the documents, then the attorneys, then the folder in front of Eleanor, as if the truth might change if she found the right object to blame. Finally, she spoke. This is impossible. Eleanor placed a certified document on the table. It is not. Vivian's voice sharpened. She can't even manage her own life. There it was. The same sentence in a different dress. The old contempt, brought out because fear had entered the room and needed somewhere to go. Eleanor did not react emotionally. Theodore anticipated that objection. The trust does not require Nora to act without professional support. It grants her directing authority and guardian responsibility, with legal, financial, and administrative advisors assigned under the trust structure. Her role is not ceremonial. It is controlling. Grant stood. I want my attorneys to review this. They may review copies after today's disclosure, Eleanor said. But the directive has been verified. Madison looked at me then, really looked. Did you know? I shook my head. Not until I found what Grandpa left. My mother's eyes cut toward me. Found? Eleanor answered before I could. Theodore created a verification process. Nora completed it within the required time. Vivian stared at me now, and something in her expression shifted. She was not sorry. Not yet. She was calculating. Replaying the last 5 days, the laughter, the comment outside the office, the way she had dismissed the key and card in front of everyone. Then Eleanor placed another document on the table. I recognized it immediately. Caldwell Development. Preliminary sale contacts. Grant went rigid. My mother's face changed. The trust also contains restrictions regarding any attempted sale or redevelopment of Whitaker Hollow, Eleanor said. No transfer, demolition approval, rezoning cooperation, or binding sale agreement may proceed without Nora's written authorization. That was when my mother finally looked at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before. Not disappointment, not contempt, not pity. Fear. I sat very still, the brass key heavy in my pocket, while the room that had laughed at me 5 days earlier had nothing left to say. No one laughed after Eleanor Price finished speaking. That should have felt like justice. 5 days earlier, my mother had smiled when I received only a brass key and a strange card. Madison had mocked it. Grant had dismissed it. Now the same room sat frozen under the weight of the truth. Grandpa's visible estate had been only the surface, and the real control rested with me. But victory did not feel the way I had imagined it might. It felt cold. It felt dangerous. Vivian left the conference room without looking at me. Grant gathered his papers too quickly, his face pale beneath the controlled expression he was trying to keep. Madison stared at her phone, but her hands were no longer relaxed. I understood then that the silence in the room was not regret. It was calculation. Eleanor walked me into the hallway before my family could reach me. Do not sign anything, she said quietly. Do not meet them alone. If Grant, Vivian, Madison, or anyone from Caldwell Development contacts you, forward everything to me. Caldwell, I repeated. The developer connected to the Whitaker Hollow sale attempt. My stomach tightened. Until that moment, Caldwell had been only a name in Grandpa's file. Eleanor's tone made it real. "Are they dangerous?" "They are motivated," she said. "And your family has already given them reason to believe the land could be sold." I looked back through the glass wall. My mother was speaking to Grant in a low, sharp voice. Madison had lifted her phone again, her thumb moving across the screen. They had spent years ignoring me, but now every one of them was aware of where I stood. By the time I reached my car, my mother had already called twice. I let the phone ring until it stopped. The third call came before I had even started the engine. I answered because my hands were shaking, and I hated that she could still do that to me. "Nora," she said, "you will come to the house tonight. Not hello, not an apology, not even a question. I'm not meeting anyone without Eleanor. This is a family matter." It became a legal matter when you tried to sell land Grandpa protected. Her silence was brief but sharp. "You don't understand what you're talking about. Grant and I have been handling these discussions for months. Without authority. Because we expected the estate to be handled by adults." The word landed exactly where she meant it to. For a second, I was back outside the law office, hearing her tell me I had only been invited out of pity. Then I looked at the trust summary on the passenger seat and forced myself to breathe. "I'm not coming tonight," I said. "You are making a serious mistake." "No," I replied, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. "I'm refusing to make yours permanent." I ended the call before she could answer. For a few minutes, I sat in the parking lot with the phone in my lap. The world did not change. No punishment came down. No door slammed. No one appeared to drag me back into the daughter I had always been. I had told my mother no, and the sky remained exactly where it was. Grant's email arrived before I reached home. He wrote like a man trying to turn wrongdoing into business language. He called Whitaker Hollow an underperforming property. He said delays could damage the family's reputation and create financial exposure. He warned that Caldwell Development had already invested time, planning, and legal resources into the project. He never mentioned the old library. He never mentioned the playground, the workers' cottages, the community hall, or the families who still used those spaces. To him, they were not places. They were obstacles. I forwarded the message to Eleanor without replying. 10 minutes later, Madison made her move. She posted a carefully written message online about grief, manipulation, and family legacy. She did not use my name. She did not need to. Everyone who knew us would understand exactly who she meant. Some people avoid responsibility for years, then suddenly claim they were chosen the moment money appears. True legacy should be protected by those who understand it. The comments came quickly. "So sad what inheritance does to families. Stay strong, Madison. There's always one relative who shows up for the money." I closed the app, but the damage had already begun. Madison knew how to make strangers feel righteous. She had turned me into a villain without ever naming me. The next day at school, I felt it. 2 teachers stopped talking when I entered the staff room. A parent looked at me too long during pickup. By lunch, cousins who had forgotten my birthday for years were sending messages about how much stress I was causing my mother. I wanted to explain everything. I wanted to tell them Grandpa had known about the sale attempt, that Grant had moved too soon, that Vivian wanted to destroy the place Theodore had spent his life protecting. But Eleanor had been clear: say nothing publicly. Let documents speak before emotions made mistakes. After school, I sat alone in the library office and called her. "They're making me look guilty," I said. "They are trying to make you react," Eleanor replied. "Do not give them that." "What if people believe Madison?" "Some will. Then they will see the evidence." I looked through the glass window of my office. A row of children's books sat waiting to be shelved. One had a torn cover I had meant to repair that morning. The ordinary sight steadied me more than Eleanor probably knew. "What happens if I block the sale?" I asked. "Grant's agreement with Caldwell may collapse. Vivian may lose influence with the board. Caldwell may threaten civil action. though their position is weak if they relied on promises from people without authority. So this is why they're panicking. Yes, Eleanor said. They thought you were harmless. That evening, I understood how wrong they had been to think the pressure would stay inside the family. A black sedan was parked across from my apartment when I came home. A man in a dark coat stepped away from it as I reached my building. Miss Whitaker, he said. Henry Caldwell. I kept my hand on my keys. My attorney handles trust matters. His smile did not change. Of course, I only hope to clear up a misunderstanding. Your family has been working toward a very beneficial arrangement. Delay can become expensive for everyone. For everyone, I repeated. For the family, he said smoothly, and possibly for the person standing in the way. The threat was wrapped in manners, but it was still a threat. Send anything you need to say to Eleanor Price. His smile thinned. Your grandfather was a difficult man. He usually had good reasons. I went inside and locked the door before he could answer. Only then did my knees weaken. I called Eleanor, told her everything, and wrote down Caldwell's words while they were still fresh. She promised to send a formal notice barring him from contacting me directly again. They are afraid, she said. That makes them careless, but not harmless. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table with Grandpa's letter in front of me. My apartment was quiet, but it no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like the first wall around something my family wanted badly enough to break rules for. Then a new email appeared. No name, no subject, just one sentence. Sign the transfer, or everyone will know what your grandfather hid. I read it twice, and the room seemed to lose warmth. Until then, I had thought the fight was about money, land, and control. But whoever sent that message believed there was another secret buried beneath the one I had already found. I forwarded the email to Eleanor, then looked toward my handbag where the brass key rested inside its inner pocket. 5 days ago, they laughed because they thought Grandpa had left me nothing. Now, they were coming for everything he had trusted me to protect. I did not sleep after the anonymous email. Sign the transfer, or everyone will know what your grandfather hid. The sentence sat on my laptop screen like a threat with no face. I forwarded it to Eleanor and waited for her call, but even after she told me not to reply, I could not stop thinking about one thing. Whoever sent it believed there was still another secret inside Grandpa's plan. The next morning, Eleanor gave me one instruction. Go back to the archive room, she said. Look for anything marked private, disputed, or restricted. If Theodore expected pressure, he may have left a record of why. Whitaker Memorial Library was nearly empty when I arrived. Morning light fell across the old reading tables, and the building smelled of dust, rain, and paper. Mrs. Bell stood behind the circulation desk, already waiting for me. She wore a gray cardigan and held a ring of keys in one hand, though we both knew only one key mattered. Eleanor called, she said. How much did she tell you? Only that Theodore's records may be needed. Mrs. Bell studied my face for a moment. And that you should not be alone when you find them. I was grateful she did not ask more. We walked together to the rear archive. The brass key turned in the lock with the same soft click as before. Inside, the room looked untouched. Wooden cabinets, rolled maps, labeled boxes, and the carved lantern on the main cabinet door. This time, I did not stop to feel the weight of the place. I had a purpose. I searched behind the property maps first, then beneath the archival box tied with cotton tape. At the very back of the cabinet, hidden flat against the wood panel, was a thin brown leather journal. There was no title on the cover, only Grandpa's initials pressed into the corner. Tu. V. Mrs. Bell pulled a chair toward me. Sit down before you open it. I sat. The first pages were dated entries about repairs, meetings, donations, and company matters. Then the pattern became clear. Grandpa had not only recorded what people did, he recorded what their choices revealed. Grant appeared in an entry about a longtime mill worker named Luis, whose wife needed surgery. Grant had suggested replacing him before medical leave became a recurring cost. Beneath that, Grandpa had written, "Grant sees people as expenses when profit is in the room." Madison appeared in a note about a literacy event. She had arrived late, taken photos with children, posted about giving back, and left before the reading began. Grandpa's comment was short. Madison loves the appearance of service more than service itself. Vivian's entries were the hardest to read. Grandpa had noted her repeated attempts to sell community properties she considered dead weight. The library, the workers' cottages, the playground, and the old mill were all listed in her proposals at different times. In one margin, Grandpa had written, "Vivian mistakes applause for legacy. She does not understand that legacy must remain useful after people stop clapping." I closed my eyes for a moment. None of it shocked me, but seeing it in Grandpa's handwriting made it impossible to excuse. Then I found my name. The first entry was about a winter book drive. I had stayed late to sort damaged donations instead of throwing them away. Grandpa wrote that I kept the repairable books because, in my words, some things only need someone patient. Another page mentioned the week. Mrs. Bell broke her wrist, and I covered extra library hours without telling the family. A third described me delivering reading packets to children in the workers' cottages during a snowstorm. The sentence near the bottom of the page blurred before I finished reading it. Nora never asks what she will receive before doing what is right. I pressed one hand over my mouth. For years I had thought those small acts vanished as soon as they were done. I had thought Grandpa loved me because he was kind enough to love the disappointing granddaughter. But the journal showed something different. He had not pitied me. He had trusted what he had seen. Mrs. Bell placed a tissue beside my hand without speaking. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. The next section explained the trust in plain language. Grandpa had built the Whitaker Lantern Trust to protect Whitaker Hollow from becoming just another asset to sell when the family wanted more money. The land was not valuable only because of acreage or location. It held the library, the old mill, the workers' cottages, the playground, and the community hall. As long as those places served education, housing, training, and public use, the trust would keep them protected. I understood then why my old paperwork mattered. The book drive reports, donation receipts, literacy program records, and maintenance confirmations had helped prove that the trust's purpose was still alive. I had signed them because Grandpa asked me to help keep the library organized. I had never known those records were part of something larger. Near the back of the journal, several pages were marked with red tabs. The first concerned Caldwell Development. Grandpa had rejected 2 offers from them while he was still healthy. They wanted demolition rights, rezoning support, and permission to turn the older neighborhood into luxury housing. His final note on the matter was direct. Caldwell will return when they believe I can no longer refuse. The next page named Vivian and Grant. They had reopened contact with Caldwell while Grandpa's health was declining, even though neither of them had authority over the trust property. Grandpa had written only one line beneath the record. They understood the price. They never understood the promise. That line hurt more than anger would have. The final red-tabbed page was folded in half. I opened it slowly. If Nora finds this, she must know I did not choose her because she is fearless. She is not. She doubts herself, and the family has taught her to mistake cruelty for judgment. But she listens before deciding. She protects what others overlook. She has never confused possession with responsibility. Wealth in proud hands becomes hunger. Wealth in careful hands can become shelter. I lowered the page to my lap. For the first time since Eleanor named me guardian of the trust, the word did not feel like someone else's coat placed over my shoulders. It was still heavy. It still frightened me. But it no longer felt impossible. Mrs. Bell sat across from me. Theodore once told me that the family would look for the heir who sounded strongest. He said he was looking for the one who kept showing up. I looked at the journal again. Why didn't he tell me? Because then it would have become a test you knew you were taking. That answer settled over the room quietly. I photographed the marked pages, placed the journal in an archival sleeve, and called Eleanor from the library office. She listened without interrupting. "Bring it to me," she said. "The journal gives us motive, history, and Theodore's reasoning. If Vivian and Grant challenge your authority, this will matter." Before leaving, I stood in the rear hallway and looked at the old photographs on the wall. Mill workers, library volunteers, children outside the first reading room. People my family had turned into background whenever money entered the conversation. Grandpa had not left me a fortune to enjoy. He had left me a promise to defend. I locked the archive door, placed the brass key back in my pocket, and walked out of the library with the journal held carefully against my chest. For the first time, I was not only afraid of what my family might do next. I was ready to answer them. Vivian and Grant filed their petition 3 days after I found Grandpa's journal. They asked the court to temporarily suspend my authority over the Whitaker Lantern Trust. Their argument was simple. I was only an elementary school librarian, inexperienced in business, real estate, and asset management. They claimed Grandpa had been emotionally attached to me in his final years, and may have allowed affection to cloud his judgment. They did not call me a thief. They were too careful for that. But every page implied I had received something I did not deserve. Madison helped from the outside. She deleted her most obvious posts after Eleanor warned her, but she replaced them with softer ones about protecting family legacy and watching grief change people. She never used my name. She did not need to. By the time local blogs picked up the dispute, strangers were already deciding I was the quiet relative who had appeared when money entered the room. For one terrible evening, I thought about giving up. I sat at my kitchen table with the petition in front of me and Grandpa's journal beside it. My mother's voice echoed through the legal language. "You are not enough, not experienced enough, not polished enough, not important enough." Then I opened the folded page Grandpa had left and read one sentence again. "She protects what others overlook." It did not erase my fear. It only reminded me that fear was not proof they were right. The hearing was held the following week. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with plain wooden benches, fluorescent lights, and a judge who looked more tired than dramatic. Vivian sat beside Grant and Madison on the opposite side. My mother wore a dark suit and pearls, her face calm enough to look wounded. Grant kept his jaw tight. Madison looked down whenever anyone glanced her way, playing the role of the heartbroken sister perfectly. Their attorney spoke first. He was polished and respectful, which made the attack sharper. He described me as well-meaning but unprepared. He said the trust contained voting rights, land assets, patents, investment accounts, and development restrictions that required sophisticated oversight. Then he looked toward me and said, "Miss Whitaker's work in a school library is honorable, but it does not qualify her to control a structure of this magnitude." A few months earlier, that sentence would have crushed me. This time, I kept my eyes on Eleanor. When she stood, she did not pretend I was a financial expert. She did something stronger. She explained that the trust had professional advisors for finance, law, and administration. My role was not to calculate every investment return or negotiate every contract alone. My role was to direct the trust according to its purpose. Theodore Whitaker did not appoint Nora Whitaker because she was the loudest business voice in the family, Eleanor said. He appointed her because he believed she would protect what the trust was created to protect. Then she laid out the timeline. The trust had been created years before Grandpa's death, while he was healthy and legally competent. Its terms had been reviewed multiple times. The succession process was not a last-minute decision. The brass key, the archive room, the card, the records, and the 5-day verification were part of a prepared structure. Their attorney called me to answer questions. My hands were cold when I took the stand. He asked about my salary, my apartment, my lack of board experience, and whether I had understood the legal meaning of every document I signed over the years. "No," I said. "I understood them as library reports, donation records, program confirmations, and community use logs." "So you admit you did not know you were helping maintain a multi-million-dollar trust?" "I did not know the financial structure behind it," I said, but I knew what those records protected. He paused. I looked at the judge and continued before my courage left me. I knew the library helped children who did not have books at home. I knew the workers' cottages still housed families connected to the old mill. I knew the playground and community hall mattered to people my family stopped noticing. I didn't know the trust was worth millions, but I knew those places were worth protecting. The courtroom became very quiet. Eleanor called Mrs. Bell next. She told the court how I had restored catalog records, organized book drives, repaired damaged donations, and kept program logs long before I knew any of it had legal significance. She did not exaggerate. That made her testimony stronger. Then Luis, a retired mill worker, took the stand. He spoke about the workers' cottages and how Grandpa had helped his family during his wife's illness. He also confirmed that Grant had once pushed to remove older workers from benefit support to reduce costs. Grant's face hardened, but he said nothing. After that, Eleanor introduced selected pages from Grandpa's journal. She did not read every entry. She only read enough to show a pattern. Grant saw people as expenses when profit was in the room. Madison loved the appearance of service more than the work of it. Vivian mistook applause for legacy. Their attorney objected, but Eleanor connected each entry to documents, dates, proposals, and witness records. The journal was not treated as gossip. It became context. Then came the Caldwell file. Eleanor presented emails showing that Vivian and Grant had reopened discussions with Caldwell Development before they had authority to sell Whitaker Hollow. The proposed plan included demolition. In one message, Grant called the library and community properties redevelopment barriers. In another, Vivian wrote that emotional attachment to old buildings should not block generational wealth. The judge read that line twice. My mother did not look at me. By the end of the hearing, the case had turned. Vivian and Grant had entered the courtroom, claiming they needed to protect Grandpa's legacy from me. But the documents showed they had already been preparing to sell the very places he had built the trust to defend. The judge denied their request to suspend my authority. He ordered all Caldwell-related communications preserved and warned both sides against public statements that could interfere with trust administration. Until further review, I remained the directing guardian. Outside the courthouse, Madison started toward a pair of local reporters, but Grant caught her wrist and stopped her. For once, even she understood that the story was no longer easy to control. Vivian walked past me without speaking. Then she stopped near the steps and turned back. You have no idea what you've started, she said. The old version of me would have looked down. Instead, I met her eyes. No, I said. I think Grandpa did. Her expression shifted, just slightly. Not regret, not yet, but the first crack in her certainty. That evening, Eleanor called to confirm that Caldwell's attorneys had requested a private settlement discussion. Grant's position at the company was now under review. Madison had removed more posts. Vivian had lost the first and most important move, but Eleanor warned me not to mistake that for peace. After we hung up, I placed Grandpa's brass key on the kitchen table beside the court papers. For weeks, I had thought truth was something hidden in letters, archives, and old journals. That day, I learned truth could stand in a courtroom and make powerful people lower their eyes. My mother had spent years saying I was too small for responsibility. By the end of that hearing, she was no longer trying to protect the family from me. She was trying to protect herself from the truth. 3 days after the hearing, Vivian Whitaker disappeared from public view. Grant was under internal review. Caldwell Development had gone quiet except through attorneys. Madison deleted the last of her posts and replaced them with a vague message about healing privately. For the first time since the will reading, no one in my family called to command, accuse, or correct me. The silence did not feel like peace. It felt like someone choosing a different weapon. On Thursday evening, while I was repairing the torn cover of a children's book at my kitchen table, someone knocked on my apartment door. The sound was soft, almost careful. When I looked through the peephole, my mother stood alone in the hallway. No lawyer, no Grant, no Madison, no flowers, no grand entrance. Just Vivian, wearing a gray dress and an expression I had never seen on her before. I opened the door but did not step aside immediately. "May I come in?" she asked. Vivian rarely asked permission. That alone told me how much had changed. I let her inside. She looked around my apartment. The bookshelves, the repaired chair by the window, the stack of library returns near the door, the kettle on the stove. In the past, she had looked at my home like proof that I had failed to become impressive. That night, she looked at it like a place where her usual authority did not reach. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Between us lay the children's book I had been repairing. Its cover was torn but salvageable. Somehow, that felt appropriate. My mother placed a folder on the table. "I need you to review this," she said. I did not touch it. "What is it?" "A revised proposal from Caldwell." My answer came immediately. "No. You haven't even read it." "I don't need to." Her mouth tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "It is not the full sale anymore. The library facade would remain. The family would avoid further legal exposure. Grant could keep his position. Madison's sponsors would stop asking questions. We could end this before Theodore's name is dragged through more courtrooms. There it was. Not an apology, a strategy. "The library facade?" I repeated. "It is a compromise." "No," I said. "It is keeping the face of something after selling its soul." Vivian looked down at the folder. "You cannot save everything, Nora." "I'm not trying to save everything. I'm trying to protect the exact thing Grandpa built the trust to protect." Her expression shifted. The patience thinned. "This family is still your family." I looked at her for a long moment. That sentence might have broken me once. I had spent years wanting to belong to the people who made me feel like an unwanted guest. So I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "Would you be here if Grandpa had left me nothing?" Vivian did not speak. The silence was enough. I nodded slowly. "If the key had opened nothing, you would not be sitting at my table. Grant would not care what I thought. Madison would still be laughing, and you would still believe I was invited out of pity." Her face tightened at the words. "I should not have said that." "No," I said. "You shouldn't have." "I was grieving. You were cruel." She looked away. For the first time, my mother had no correction ready. No sharper sentence. No polished explanation. Just silence. "I judged you unfairly," she said at last. "Yes. I thought you had chosen a small life because you were afraid of a larger one." I glanced at the repaired book beneath my hand. "You never understood that quiet does not mean empty." I see that now. I wanted those words to heal more than they did. Some part of me still wanted to believe that this was the moment everything changed, that my mother had finally arrived as the person I had needed all my life. But the folder was still on the table. She had come with papers. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Sign the revised agreement," she said. "Let the board restructure the trust committee. You can stay involved. Publicly, we will say it was your decision." "My decision," I said quietly. "It would make you look reasonable." There it was again. Image, reputation, control. I pushed the folder back toward her without opening it. "No. Nora, listen to me. I have listened to you my entire life." The words stopped her. I kept my voice steady. "I listened when you called my work sweet because you could not call it meaningful. I listened when you praised Madison and Grant for becoming exactly what you wanted. I listened when you told me I was only invited out of pity, and for years I let your opinion become heavier than my own life." Vivian sat very still. "I'm done doing that," I said. "I am not signing Caldwell's agreement. I am not transferring authority to a family committee. I am not letting Grant manage what he tried to sell. I am not letting Madison turn community work into another brand campaign. And I am not handing you control just because you are uncomfortable without it." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. You are punishing me. No, I said. I am protecting something from you. There is a difference. That sentence landed hard. I saw it in her face. For a while, neither of us spoke. Rain began tapping softly against the window. My mother looked smaller at my kitchen table than she ever had in the family estate. Without the house, the pearls, and the room full of people trained to obey her, she was just a woman facing the daughter she had underestimated for too long. I was wrong about you, she said. I believed her. But I also knew belief was not the same as surrender. I forgive you for being wrong, I said, but forgiveness does not mean I will give you back the power to hurt what Grandpa trusted me to protect. She closed her eyes. I don't know how to fix this. Then don't start by trying to control the outcome. When she stood to leave, she almost forgot the folder. I picked it up and handed it back to her. Her fingers brushed mine, cold and tense. At the door, she turned once more. Your grandfather would be proud of you, she said. A month earlier, I would have needed those words like air. That night, they mattered, but they did not define me. I know, I said. After she left, I locked the door and stood in the quiet apartment. I did not feel victorious. I felt sad, tired, and clear. The next morning, I called Eleanor. No settlement with Caldwell, I said. We protect Whitaker Hollow. There was a brief pause. Then Eleanor said, Your grandfather chose well. For the first time, I did not argue with that. The official decision came 6 weeks later. Caldwell Development withdrew from the Whitaker Hollow project after Eleanor's team filed notice that the trust would not approve any sale, partial transfer, demolition agreement, or rezoning support. Their attorneys called it a strategic reassessment. Eleanor called it what it was. They had lost the only signature that mattered. Grant was removed from the development committee 2 days after that. The board did not make a public spectacle of it, but the message was clear. He had promised access to land he did not control, and the people who had trusted his confidence were now asking uncomfortable questions. Madison issued one careful apology online, saying she had spoken from grief without full information. It was polished, vague, and not really for me. Still, it was the first time she had ever stepped back from a story she wanted to own. Vivian did not call. For a while, I thought her silence would hurt. Instead, it gave me space to work. With Eleanor's guidance, I approved the first phase of the Whitaker Lantern Center. The old library would be restored, not replaced. The mill would become a vocational training space for young adults and displaced workers. The playground would be rebuilt. The workers' cottages would be repaired and protected as affordable housing. A scholarship fund would be opened in Grandpa Theodore's name for children from the neighborhood. The first time I signed documents as directing guardian, my hand trembled, not because I doubted the decision, but because I finally understood the difference between owning something and being responsible for it. My family had looked at Whitaker Hollow and seen money trapped in old buildings. Grandpa had looked at it and seen memory, labor, shelter, education, and promises still unfinished. For months, I spent my evenings between the library and Eleanor's office. Mrs. Bell helped sort the archive records. Louise volunteered to speak with retired workers about the mill restoration. Teachers from my school donated books for the children's room. People who had never been invited into Whitaker family meetings began shaping the future of land my family had almost sold without them. That felt right. The work was not glamorous. There were permits, inspections, repair estimates, budget meetings, arguments about plumbing, and one terrible afternoon when a contractor discovered water damage behind the old reading room wall. But every problem felt honest. No one was laughing at a key. No one was pretending a library facade could replace a living library. We were not preserving appearances. We were restoring purpose. 1 year after Grandpa's death, the Whitaker Lantern Center opened its doors. The morning of the dedication was bright and cold. Sunlight moved across the restored brick walls, catching on the new brass letters above the entrance. Children stood near the front steps with their parents, impatient to get inside. Former mill workers gathered near the old factory doors, touching the clean stone like they were greeting an old friend. In the courtyard, volunteers arranged chairs while Mrs. Bell complained that no one knew how to stack programs neatly. I stood near the entrance holding Grandpa's brass key in my coat pocket. I no longer carried it because I needed proof. I carried it because it reminded me that the smallest object in the room had once changed the direction of my life. Eleanor stood beside me. "Ready?" "No," I said. She smiled. "Good. People who feel completely ready for responsibility usually worry me." That made me laugh. The ceremony was simple. A teacher spoke about the new reading programs. Louise spoke about the mill, and the people who had built the company before the Whitaker name became polished enough for boardrooms. Mrs. Bell spoke for too long, ignored the schedule completely, and made half the audience cry anyway. Then it was my turn. I walked to the small podium and looked at the crowd. For most of my life, I had hated rooms where people looked at me. I always felt judged before I even spoke. But this room was different. These were not people waiting for me to prove I deserved a fortune. They were people waiting for a door to open. My grandfather believed places remember us, I said. He believed a library, a mill, a home, or a playground could hold the work and kindness of the people who passed through them. He also believed that wealth should not erase memory. It should protect what still has the power to serve. I paused and looked toward the restored library windows. For a long time, I thought inheritance meant what someone left behind after they were gone. My grandfather taught me it can also mean what we choose to protect after we finally understand why it mattered. When I stepped away from the podium, the applause was warm but not overwhelming. I was grateful for that. I did not need thunder. I only needed the doors to open. As families began moving inside, I saw Vivian near the back of the courtyard. She had come alone. She wore a dark coat and stood apart from the crowd, not trying to be seen, not trying to direct anyone. For a moment, I considered pretending I had not noticed her. Then our eyes met, and she walked toward me. "You did well," she said. "Thank you." Her gaze moved past me to the building, to the children entering the library, to the older workers standing near the mill doors. There was something in her face I could not name exactly. Regret, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding. "I was wrong about this place," she said. I waited. "And I was wrong about you." The words were quiet. No audience, no performance, no folder in her hand. That made them feel different from the night she came to my apartment. I nodded. "I know. A year earlier, I might have said more. I might have tried to comfort her, or make the moment easier, or turn her regret into something we could both pretend was healing. But I had learned that not every silence needed to be filled. Some silences were allowed to stand as evidence." Vivian looked at me carefully. "Do you think we can ever be close?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we can be honest. That would be a start." She accepted that with a small nod. It was not a perfect ending. It was not a daughter running into her mother's arms. It was something quieter, and maybe more real. Behind us, children rushed into the restored reading room. Their laughter spilled through the open doors and rose into the cold morning air. I turned and watched them scatter between the shelves, pulling books free with the excitement of people who had not yet learned to measure value in dollars. Near the entrance, a bronze plaque had been set into the wall. "The greatest inheritance is character proven when no one is watching." I touched the edge of it lightly. For years, my family had believed I was the small life, the quiet daughter, the one invited only out of pity. They had looked at me and seen someone easy to dismiss. Grandpa had looked longer. He had seen the person I was when there was no applause, no reward, and no reason to pretend. The brass key had not opened a box of money. It had opened the truth. The person they invited out of pity was the only one Grandpa had trusted with everything.